second headlight talk presenter is Marina McLerran, a master's student in music education in the Cross School of Music. The title of her talk is Instrumental Music Education for Music Students with Hearing Impairment.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining my session today. Before I was a graduate student here at the University of Miami, I was a band director in Texas, and I've been a musician for my entire life. I've been interested in hearing and hearing loss for a long time, and then as a music educator, I had the opportunity to work with a student who was losing his hearing at the same time that he was trying to learn a band instrument. So as a music educator, I had to make an effort to work with him to help reach that goal, but I found a lack of available resources and training on the topic of teaching music to someone who is losing their hearing. So I decided to make that my research topic for my thesis this year for my master's. And when I started doing my literature review, I found that there really just is not very much information already being completed about specifically instrumental music education. Hearing loss and music together have been studied for decades, but the majority of the existing research focuses primarily on general music, music in early childhood, and vocal ensembles. And there's very little for specifically band and orchestra directors. And then also there's very little research looking at students in the secondary grades, by which I mean middle school and high school, like what I was working with. So I'm going to be using the term inclusive classroom or inclusive education. And what I mean by that is a classroom that has students with and without disabilities. It is required by law in public schools in the United States that we offer that option to students of all abilities. The first act was passed in the 1970s. It was known as IDEA, and it has recently been updated and extended in 2015, known as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA. And even though this law, which states that all schools must include all students, has been in effect for over 40 years now, it still does not include any information for schools about how inclusive education is supposed to take place. It does not include any additional funding or resources for educators to achieve this goal. And there's no subject-specific information. So for example, myself as a music educator working with a student who is experiencing hearing loss, there's no information in this law for me about how to do that, except that it is required by law to include that student in my ensembles. Created a survey which I sent to band and orchestra directors who teach at the middle school level across the country, and I received back 168 complete responses from music educators across 38 states with between 1 and 40 years of teaching experience. So I found some interesting things with the survey responses for my study. The first was in contrast to existing research about music educator attitudes towards inclusion, the majority of the participants for my study responded with generally favorable attitudes towards the inclusion of students who are deaf or hearing impaired into instrumental ensembles. So that's exciting because it indicates a shift in music educator attitudes over recent decades in favor of inclusive education and in favor of working with students with different degrees of hearing. Now, that being said, the majority of the sample reported that they did not feel that their undergraduate studies prepared them to teach this population of students in an inclusive classroom. You might be surprised to learn that even though as music education majors who are studying primarily how to teach students manipulation and creation of sound, and we primarily are going to be working with student hearing, there are no standardized courses, hearing health, hearing loss, or sometimes even working in inclusive classrooms required as part of our undergraduate degree plans. It varies by university, but it's not common. And so it is understandable that the majority of the sample, like me, was not really prepared to teach a student who is experiencing hearing loss. Now, why does this matter? Well, I found an unusually high or an unexpectedly high amount of my sample had actually already had experience working with students who are deaf or hearing impaired. Of my sample, which again was 168 participants from across the country, half reported that they have a student currently enrolled this school year who has some degree of hearing impairment, and 80% of the sample have taught at least one student who is deaf or hearing impaired in their entire teaching career. So based on those numbers, based on the findings of my study, it is reasonable for middle school music educators to expect to work with a student who is deaf or hearing impaired at some point in their instrumental teaching career. So it's definitely something that needs to start being addressed more frequently. Now, despite the large amount of the sample who had worked with students with hearing impairment before, I was surprised that only half of the sample responded that they are confident that they could recognize the signs of hearing loss in their students. Again, this presumably stems from us as music education majors not really studying hearing and hearing loss in general as part of our undergraduate studies. But it's definitely something as educators who work primarily with sound that probably should be addressed if the majority of or half of the sample are not sure how hearing loss even presents in students. Probably should be addressed. 40% of my sample is already using some kind of American Sign Language in their instrumental music education. And that's interesting for two reasons. For one, not every person who has hearing loss uses American Sign Language, so 40% is pretty high. And then two, to my knowledge, there's no standardized system of teaching music using American Sign Language. So I'd be really interested to look at how exactly these music educators are using American Sign Language in their teaching already, and is it something that could be applied to music education in general? Is it something that that could really benefit the field? Looking into that a little bit more. So these last two findings are consistent with my personal experience and with the existing research, but still disappointing that less than 1/3 of the sample, I think it was 29%, less than 1/3 of the sample reported that they are regularly attending the IEP meetings for the students in their programs. IEP meetings are the meetings where the special education department, the student, their parents, and supposedly all of the teachers that work with that student get together and create updated goals. It's a formal legal document. And so for music educators to be across the board excluded from these meetings is a problem when we're then expected to teach these students in inclusive classrooms. And oftentimes as music educators, we teach the students for multiple school years. So this is something that definitely also needs to be addressed, that music educators need to be getting included in the IEP meetings. In the same vein, 80% of my sample reported that they are not getting the professional development that they need on the topic of teaching inclusive classrooms for students who are deaf or hearing impaired. 80%. So again, I believe, based on the findings of my study, that there is a population of music educators who need this information, who are already teaching students with hearing impairment, who are not having access to this information or these training resources. And that needs to be addressed. So it will be a goal of mine in my future studies to look at generating more research on this topic and potentially developing more accessible and tangible resources for the music educators that are working in this circumstance as I did. I want to thank you so much for attending my session. I do encourage you to reach out if you would like to learn more about my topic or music education in general. I'd like to wish you a wonderful rest of the symposium this afternoon.